The road stretched before him like an unbroken ribbon of ice, slick and unyielding beneath the weight of his 18-wheeler. The snow had been falling for hours, and the sky, vast, gray, and indifferent, held no promise of letting up. Frank Dawson adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his thick fingers stiff from the cold, despite the heat blasting through the vents. It had been years since he'd stopped checking the weather before a haul. What did it matter? Storm or shine, the job had to be done. Frank wasn't a man who let things rattle him. He had been driving long-haul routes for more than 30 years, and there wasn't a stretch of highway in the country he hadn't seen. But tonight, something gnawed at him. It wasn't the storm, nor the biting wind rattling the edges of his rig. It was something deeper, something unnamed, a strange premonition, a whisper at the back of his mind that wouldn't be silenced. He told himself it was just fatigue. Ahead, the Dalton Highway wound its way through the frozen wilderness of Alaska, a treacherous path carved through an unforgiving land. Frank had been up this way more times than he could count, hauling fuel, food, and supplies to the scattered villages that depended on truckers like him. The Yukon Valley was his route this time, and he had precious cargo, medical supplies for a remote town that had been cut off due to the storm. The deadline was tight. The conditions, worse. But this was the work. He exhaled, watching his breath cloud momentarily before vanishing into the cab's warmth. At 58, Frank felt every year of his life settle into his bones. The long nights, the endless miles, they had been his closest companions since Carol passed. It had been 6 years now, though some days it still felt like yesterday. Carol had always worried about him out on the road. "Don't let yourself turn into a ghost, Frankie," she told him once, wrapping her small hands around his own. "Come home once in a while." But Frank didn't have a home anymore. Not really. He had their old house in Montana, but it sat empty most of the time. He kept moving, kept driving, because stopping meant feeling the weight of all that had been lost. So instead, he let the road swallow him whole. Tonight, though, the silence pressed in heavier than usual. Something about this run felt different. Maybe it was the way the other truckers at the diner back in Coldfoot had been unusually quiet. Normally, the place was full of rough laughter and the clatter of coffee cups, but that evening, the men had sat in silence, staring into their mugs as the wind howled outside. Or maybe it was the way Jim Miller, his trucking partner, had hesitated before saying, "Be careful out there, Frank." Frank had chuckled. "Since when do I need luck, Jim?" But Jim hadn't smiled. He had just given a small shake of his head, as if something unspoken lingered between them. Now, hours later, as he pressed onward through the storm, Frank found himself thinking about it more than he liked. Ahead, the headlights illuminated a world made of ice and shadow. The snow came down in thick, sweeping gusts, obscuring the edges of the road. Out here, there were no guardrails, no safety measures, just the vast, unbroken wilderness stretching for miles in every direction. Frank had driven through plenty of rough weather before, but tonight, the wind moaned through the trees like a living thing. He turned up the radio, hoping to break the silence, but the signal was nothing but static. He was alone out here. Just like always. But then, just as he was beginning to sink into the usual rhythm of the drive, something shifted at the edges of his vision. A movement. A shadow. Frank's grip tightened on the wheel. Something was out there, beyond the reach of his headlights. Something was watching. Frank leaned forward slightly, squinting through the windshield as the snow continued its relentless assault on the world outside. The high beams barely cut through the swirling flurries, and beyond that, just darkness. The Dalton Highway had never been an easy road. Some called it the most dangerous route in America. One bad decision, one wrong turn, and a man could find himself stranded in the middle of nowhere, his truck buried under 6 feet of snow, waiting for rescue that might not come. Frank had never feared the road before. But tonight, there was something different about the way the wind howled through the mountains, something unsettling about the way the trees bent under the weight of the storm. A shiver crawled down his spine, and not from the cold. He reached for the radio, flipping to the channel where Jim was supposed to check in. "Jim, you out there?" "Nothing. Just the low hum of static." Frank frowned and tried again. "Jim, it's Frank. You copy?" Silence. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Jim should have been an hour behind him at most, but if his truck had gotten caught in the worsening weather, it could mean trouble. Frank had seen what happened to truckers who underestimated this road. He had found one once, years ago, some kid from California, barely 30, who had taken a wrong turn near Adigan Pass. By the time they pulled him out of his cab, the frost had already claimed him. Frank shook the thought away. Jim was seasoned, a man who knew these roads almost as well as Frank did. He'd be fine. At least, Frank hoped so. He reached for his coffee, but it had gone cold. The bitter taste clung to his tongue as he swallowed anyway. The snow was falling harder now, and the wipers struggled against the ice forming along the edges of the glass. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel. Something wasn't right. Then he saw them. The tracks. Large, deep prints pressed into the fresh snow, crossing the highway in a jagged path. Frank's brow furrowed. He had seen wolf tracks before, smaller than this, more cautious in their placement. But these were huge. The kind that made the hair on the back of a man's neck stand up. A wolf this size would have to be at least 150 pounds, maybe more. Bigger than any Frank had seen this far north. But what bothered him most wasn't the size, it was the pattern. These weren't the usual tracks of an animal simply passing through. They were scattered, erratic, like something had been circling the road. Like something had been watching. Frank swallowed hard and kept driving. The highway stretched on, winding through the dark, the only company the moan of the wind and the rhythmic hum of the tires over ice. The snow kept falling. The radio stayed silent. And the feeling in Frank's gut only grew worse. 15 minutes later, more tracks appeared. Then more. Now, they weren't just crossing the road. They were lining it. Frank exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel with both hands. He tried to push away the thoughts clawing at the edges of his mind, but something deep inside him, some old, primal instinct, was screaming at him to be careful. He had heard the stories. The ones the old-timers told late at night over black coffee and burned-out cigarettes. Wolves don't hunt men. Not unless they have a reason. Frank had laughed at those stories. But tonight, he wasn't laughing. Then, through the thick veil of snow, something moved. It stepped onto the road, slow and deliberate. A wolf. No, the wolf. Frank barely had time to react before he slammed on the brakes, his heart hammering as the massive creature emerged from the storm. His tires skidded over the ice, the truck lurched forward, and for a split second, Frank thought he was going to lose control. But then, the truck stopped. And the wolf stood there, staring at him. A giant, its thick fur a perfect white that shimmered under the headlights. Its eyes, deep amber, glowing almost supernatural in the night, locked onto Frank's through the windshield. And in that moment, he knew. This was no ordinary wolf. And this was no ordinary night. Frank's breathing slowed, his hands tightening around the steering wheel as he locked eyes with the massive wolf standing in the middle of the road. It was bigger than any wolf he had ever seen, easily over 150 pounds, its thick fur blending almost seamlessly with the snow-covered landscape. The headlights caught the shimmer of frost on its coat, making it look ghostly, otherworldly. But it wasn't just the size that unsettled him. It was the way the wolf stood there, unflinching, not with the nervousness of prey but with the calm authority of something that did not fear him. It wasn't running. It wasn't attacking. It was waiting. Frank exhaled, the fog of his breath clouding the cab's already frosted glass. For the first time in a long time, he felt small. He had been on these roads for more than 3 decades, had faced blizzards, mechanical failures, even a moose that once totaled a truck right in front of him. But nothing had ever made his chest tighten like this. Something about the wolf's eyes held him there, amber, intelligent, watching. Frank had always been told that wolves didn't make eye contact like this. Wild animals avoided confrontation, avoided looking too long. This one wasn't looking away. A choice. Frank could gun it, push through the storm, and hope the wolf moved in time. Or his gut twisted. Or he could wait. He didn't know why he hesitated, but he did. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the gear shift, moving the truck into neutral. The rumble of the engine softened, the growl of the machine no longer challenging the silence. The wolf tilted its head ever so slightly. And then, as if responding to some silent signal, shadows began to emerge from the trees. Frank's stomach dropped. They came from both sides of the road, silent as ghosts, their forms blending into the darkness. 1, 2, 3, no, at least a dozen. A whole pack. Their breath fogged in the freezing air, their coats dusted with snow, their movements slow, deliberate. Frank's fingers hovered over the switch for his high beams, debating whether or not to get a better look. He let his hand fall back. There was no need. He already understood. This wasn't an attack. This was something else. His chest tightened. He had heard of wolves surrounding trucks before, but usually when an animal was wounded, sick, or desperate for food. These wolves didn't look desperate. They looked exhausted. One of the smaller ones limped, its back leg barely touching the ground. Another, a young female, had dried blood on her coat, a wound along her ribs. Frank swallowed hard. They had been fighting for something. Or maybe for someone. And then, the alpha wolf moved first. The great white beast took one slow step forward, breaking from the pack, walking toward Frank's truck with purpose. Not hunting. Not stalking. It walked like a leader approaching an equal. Frank barely blinked before the next movement made his breath catch. From the shadows behind the alpha, a smaller figure stumbled forward. A pup. Tiny, trembling, barely old enough to be out in the cold alone. Its fur, silver white, matched the great wolf standing above it. And yet, it was frail. Weak. Frank's chest tightened as he recognized the truth. This wasn't a standoff. This was a plea. The alpha wolf turned to face Frank again, its massive body lowering just slightly as it nuzzled the pup forward. The message was clear. The pack had come to ask for help. And Frank Dawson, a man who had spent his whole life believing he owed nothing to the world but the miles under his tires, was the only one who could give it. Frank had seen a lot of things in his years on the road, wrecks, stranded travelers, even a bear that once chased him back into his truck. But nothing compared to this. A full pack of wolves, standing in the middle of a frozen highway, staring at him like he was the only thing left in the world that could save them. And at the center of it all, the alpha wolf, its powerful frame dusted with frost, nudging the frail pup forward. Frank swallowed hard. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a random encounter. This was something deliberate. The white wolf's amber eyes never wavered, locked onto his, waiting. Frank had never been a man who put much stock in fate. But as he sat there in the warmth of his truck, staring out at a dying pup in the middle of the wilderness, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The pup let out a small, pitiful whimper, barely more than a whisper against the howling wind. The sound hit Frank like a punch to the chest. His hands hovered over the gearshift. He knew what logic said. He knew that this was nature's way, that stepping in could mean interfering with a balance he didn't fully understand. But then he thought about Carol. How she used to stop on the side of the road for every stray dog she ever saw. How she once brought home a half-starved kitten she found near a truck stop in Colorado. Sometimes, Frankie, she'd told him, scratching behind the kitten's ears, we don't get to choose who needs us. Frank exhaled, the memory pressing against his ribs like a weight. He made up his mind. Slowly, he reached for the door handle. The second he pulled it, a blast of Arctic wind roared through the cab, cutting into his skin like a blade. The wolves tensed, their bodies instinctively shifting closer together, as if bracing for an attack. Frank raised both hands, palms open. Easy, now. His voice was low, calm. The same way he used to talk to nervous cattle back when he worked his uncle's ranch as a kid. The alpha wolf didn't move. It just watched. Measured. Waiting. Frank took a slow step forward. The crunch of his boots on the snow was the only sound between them. The other wolves stood motionless, their breaths fogging in the cold, their ribs visible beneath their thick winter coats. Too thin. They were all too thin. Frank's gaze flickered back to the pup. It lay curled in the snow, its tiny body trembling, each breath a struggle. His chest tightened. He knelt down, moving slowly, carefully, keeping his movements measured. The mother wolf, a smaller gray female with a gash along her side, let out a soft, broken sound, something between a growl and a whimper. Frank paused, looking up at her. Her eyes were dark, pleading. She wasn't challenging him. She was begging. Something about that nearly broke him. He had seen that look before. In men. In war. In the eyes of a father holding his son in a hospital hallway, in the quiet desperation of a woman saying goodbye to her husband before deployment. It was the look of someone with no options left. Frank reached out, brushing his fingertips against the pup's soft fur. It didn't react, didn't move away. It was too weak. Too cold. Frank carefully slipped his hands beneath the fragile body, lifting it up. The mother wolf let out a low, mournful howl, and the sound sent a shiver straight through him. The rest of the pack joined in, their voices rising into the storm, filling the night with something ancient and aching. Not anger. Not warning. Farewell. Frank swallowed against the lump in his throat. Still cradling the pup, he slowly stood up. The alpha wolf stepped forward, close enough that Frank could see the scar along its muzzle, the gray strands mixed into its thick white coat. For the first time, the great beast broke eye contact, just for a moment, lowering its massive head to gently nuzzle the pup one last time. Then it stepped back. A silent permission. A final trust. Frank gave a small nod. Then, without another word, he turned back toward the truck. The wind screamed around him as he climbed into the cab, slamming the door shut behind him. Inside, the warmth wrapped around him like a blanket, but he barely noticed. He grabbed his flannel jacket from the passenger seat, the one Carol had given him on their last Christmas together, and carefully wrapped the pup in its folds. Tiny shivers racked its small body. Frank reached for his thermos, twisting the cap off and letting a few drops of warm broth drip onto his fingers before carefully pressing them to the pup's mouth. For a moment, nothing. Then, a weak, hesitant lick. Frank let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Outside, through the snow-covered windshield, the wolves had begun to move. One by one, they faded into the darkness, swallowed by the storm, until only the alpha remained. It stood there for a long moment, watching. Then, like a whisper, like a ghost, it was gone. Frank leaned back against his seat, staring down at the small bundle in his lap. "Guess it's just you and me now, kid," he murmured. The pup shifted slightly, pressing its tiny body deeper into the warmth of his jacket. For the first time in a long time, Frank didn't feel alone. Frank sat in the driver's seat, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, but he wasn't thinking about the road ahead. He was thinking about the tiny, trembling body in his lap. The pup barely moved, its breath shallow but steady, wrapped in the warmth of Frank's old flannel jacket. The heat from the truck's vents worked slowly to thaw its frozen limbs, but it was clear the little thing was on the edge of survival. Frank wasn't sure what made him hesitate. He could still turn back. He could step out into the storm, set the pup down in the snow, and let nature take its course. The wolves might still be out there, waiting for their lost one. That would be the logical thing to do. But he knew better. The pack hadn't come to take the pup back. They had come to leave it with him. Why me? Frank sighed, leaning his head against the seat, staring at the frost forming in the corners of the windshield. He wasn't a father. He wasn't a savior. He was just a trucker, a man who spent his life running away from anything that required him to feel too much. But tonight, for the first time in years, he wasn't running. A soft, barely audible sound came from the bundle in his lap, a weak, feeble whimper. Frank's chest tightened. He remembered another sound like that once. A hospital room. A heart monitor. Carol's last breath. Something inside him cracked open, just a little. He looked down at the fragile creature, curled up like it was trying to disappear into itself. Small. Helpless. Alone. Just like he had been since the day he lost her. Frank ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. "Well, kid," he muttered, "looks like we're stuck with each other." The words felt foreign coming out of his mouth, like they belonged to someone else. He wasn't good at this, at caring. He didn't have the time or patience for it. But the decision was already made. Not by logic. Not by reason. By something older, deeper, the same instinct that had kept him moving for all these years, the same instinct that told him he was meant to be here, in this moment, with this life in his hands. Carefully, he shifted the pup onto the passenger seat, keeping the flannel wrapped tight around its tiny body. It didn't resist. Just curled deeper into the warmth, as if it had already accepted its fate. Frank sighed and reached for the gear shift, putting the truck back in motion. The wheels groaned against the ice, and slowly, steadily, he began moving forward, pushing through the last remnants of the storm. The road ahead was long. But for the first time in a long time, Frank didn't mind the miles. He glanced at the pup beside him, its body rising and falling in soft, steady breaths. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just about saving a life. Maybe this was about saving two. The hum of the engine filled the cab, steady and familiar, a sound that had been Frank's only companion for years. But tonight, there was something different. He wasn't alone. The little pup lay curled on the passenger seat, tucked into his flannel jacket, its fragile body barely moving. The truck's heater had done its job, melting away the frost that clung to its fur. Frank risked a glance at it. It was small, impossibly small, but there was something about the way it had nestled into the fabric, like it had already decided this was home. Frank shook his head and focused back on the road. The storm had begun to ease, the heavy snowfall tapering into a fine mist that clung to the windshield. It was still bitterly cold, but the worst had passed. The Dalton Highway stretched before him, winding through the endless Alaskan wilderness, nothing but miles and miles of white in every direction. And yet, for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel so empty. Frank reached for the radio, half expecting static. Instead, a faint crackle, then a voice. "Frank? You out there? Jim?" Frank exhaled, pressing the button on the side of the receiver. "Yeah. I'm here. Jesus, man. Thought you got buried in that storm." Frank hesitated. He could tell Jim the truth, that something had changed back there in the snow. That he had stopped for something that logic told him he shouldn't have. But he wasn't ready for that. "Just took it slow," he said instead. "You close?" "About an hour behind. Thought I saw some tracks back there. Big ones. Pack of wolves, maybe." Frank's grip tightened slightly on the wheel. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "I saw him too." Jim let out a low whistle. That must have been a hell of a sight. Frank glanced at the pup beside him, its tiny body rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. "Yeah," he murmured. "It was." The conversation drifted into the usual talk, road conditions, weather updates, a rundown of deliveries, but Frank only half listened. His mind was still back there, in the snow, in the quiet space where something wordless had passed between him and the wolves. It wasn't just about the pup. It was about trust. About letting go of fear. And maybe, just maybe, about finding a reason to stop running. He pulled the thermos from the cup holder and unscrewed the lid, carefully tilting it to let another few drops of warm broth spill onto his fingers. He reached down, brushing the warm liquid against the pup's tiny nose. For a moment, nothing. Then, a flicker of movement, a slow, weak lap of its tongue. Frank felt something tighten in his chest, but it wasn't the usual weight of loneliness. It was something softer. Something like hope. The pup stirred slightly, shifting in the flannel, its small body curling deeper into the warmth. Frank exhaled, watching as the storm finally broke, revealing a sky littered with stars. The road stretched ahead, still long, still lonely, but not as lonely as it had been. For the first time in years, Frank wasn't just driving toward a destination. He was driving home. The pup grew stronger by the day. At first, it had been touch and go. There were nights when Frank wasn't sure if the little thing would make it. He'd wake up in the middle of a rest stop, heart pounding, checking to see if the fragile body on the passenger seat was still breathing. But it held on. Somehow, against the odds, the pup kept fighting. By the time Frank finished his delivery in the Yukon Valley and made his way back south, the little thing had already claimed its place beside him. It slept curled in the passenger seat, tucked into the old flannel jacket that Frank had stopped pretending was his anymore. When he got out at truck stops, the pup's ears perked up, its eyes following his every move. And when he climbed back in, the pup let out a soft, contented sigh, as if it had been waiting for him to return all along. Frank wasn't sure when he stopped thinking about it as a wild animal and started thinking of it as his. Maybe it was the way it would nuzzle against his arm on cold nights, seeking warmth. Maybe it was the way it watched him, those golden eyes filled with something too knowing for a creature that young. Or maybe it was the first time he said its name, a name he hadn't even realized he'd been thinking about until it slipped out one night, quiet and certain. Ghost. The pup had lifted its head, ears twitching. Like it had known all along. Ghost. It fit. It fit the way the pup had come to him like a whisper in the snow, like something half-remembered from a dream. It fit the way it moved silently beside him, never making a sound unless it needed to. It fit the way it had filled the space beside him, the space that had once been so unbearably empty. Frank had never been a man who needed much company. But now, the cab of his truck felt different. He found himself talking more, even if Ghost didn't understand half of what he said. He'd grumble about the road conditions, about the guys at the way stations giving him a hard time, about how he wasn't getting any younger. Ghost would just watch him, blinking slow and steady, like he was actually listening. And in the nights when the road stretched too long, when the miles ahead felt endless and the silence started creeping in too deep, Frank would reach over, run a hand through Ghost's thickening fur, and remind himself that he wasn't alone anymore. The loneliness didn't vanish. But for the first time in years, it didn't consume him. Ghost grew fast, stronger every day. By the time spring came, the small bundle of fur had turned into a sleek, powerful creature with silver-white fur and eyes that burned like the sun over fresh snow. At truck stops, people stared. A wolf in a trucker's cab wasn't something you saw every day. But Frank didn't care. Ghost wasn't just a wolf anymore. He was his. And Frank, whether he had meant to or not, was his too. They had chosen each other. And Frank wasn't going back to the way things were before. Not ever. The years had a way of slipping past, the miles blurring together like the endless stretch of highway beneath Frank's wheels. Ghost had grown into a powerful, majestic creature, his thick silver-white fur rippling in the wind whenever they stopped along the roadside. And despite everything, despite the whispers at truck stops and the wary glances from strangers, he stayed. Ghost could have left any time. There were nights when Frank parked the truck along the edge of a snow-covered ridge, and Ghost would step out into the night, lifting his head toward the wilderness he was born from. He would stand there for a long time, still as stone, listening to something Frank could never hear. But every single time, he came back. Frank didn't call for him. Didn't need to. Ghost always returned, his golden eyes meeting Frank's in the dark before curling up beside him, pressing against his side with the weight of something certain, unshakable. And that was how Frank learned something he had never truly understood before. Home wasn't a place. It wasn't four walls and a roof. It wasn't Montana, where Carol had once made a life for them. Home was something else entirely. It was the weight of another soul beside you. The steady presence of something, or someone, that chose to stay. And Ghost had chosen. Just like Frank had chosen him all those years ago, out in the middle of that frozen road, with nothing but the wind and the wolves watching. Frank wasn't a man who talked much about fate. But sometimes, he wondered. One night, as winter settled over the Yukon Valley once again, Ghost lifted his head. Frank knew that look. He was listening. His ears perked, his body tensed, not with fear, but with recognition. And then, in the stillness of the night, a howl rose in the distance. It was long and low, carried by the wind, a sound from another world. A sound from where Ghost had come from. Ghost stood, stepping away from the truck, his tail flicking once. He turned his head toward the sound, his golden eyes flashing. Frank felt something tighten in his chest, though he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just waited. Ghost stood there for a long time. Then, finally, he let out his own howl. It wasn't one of loneliness. It wasn't a call for rescue. It was an answer. A message sent across the mountains. A part of him still belonged to the wild. Frank felt it in his bones, deep and unshakable. He reached out, resting a hand against Ghost's back. The fur was thick beneath his fingers, warm and familiar. And then, just like every time before, Ghost turned back. He stepped toward Frank, pressing his massive head against his chest for just a moment. Then he lay down at his feet, curling up like he always had. Frank let out a slow breath, one he hadn't realized he was holding. "Yeah," he muttered, staring out into the darkness. "I know, kid. The wolves would always call. And maybe, one day, Ghost would answer. But tonight, he was still home. And Frank, for the first time in a long, long while, wasn't afraid of what came next.